Hi Founder fans, Jason here. Happy Constitution Day, and do I have a treat for you in celebration of this holiday, which, by the way, September 17th, if you don't know, is Constitution Day, because that's the day all the people who signed the Constitution signed the Constitution. And in celebration, we spoke, or I spoke, and you will hear me speak to one of the founding parents of the United States, a Mr. President, Mr. James Madison. And I asked him about the Constitution and some of the build-up to the Constitution, the convention itself, and some of the process of ratifying afterwards. So let's take a look. Without further ado, enjoy. Today we will be interviewing President James Madison. Mr. President, thank you so much for being here.
Mr. Mandresh, it couldn't be more of a privilege.
Well, since you gave us a few minutes of your time, I figure we'll get right into it, ask the real good question. So first of all, since we're celebrating Constitution Day here in the future, I was wondering if you could tell us what was the circumstance leading up to the Constitutional Convention, or as you guys called it, the Philadelphia Convention.
Well, I see you. You know that we fought a Revolutionary War against Great Britain in order to throw off its chains of tyranny with King George III. And when we did come out a winner, so to speak, and have the Treaty of Paris signed in 1783 to end the hostilities, we were in a bit of a conundrum because we were operating under a governmental system that was ineffective. It was weak. It was titled officially the Articles of Confederation. And we fought with those stipulations in mind when we were in the war itself, because it didn't get ratified by all 13 of the states unanimously until 1781, which officially just put the signature on what we had already been implementing. But some gentlemen that began thinking about what we must do in order to stand on the world stage now, with Great Britain still, and France and other countries, and with the Napoleonic War still in process and the French Revolution still in process, we needed to understand what to do with ourselves. And this was, of course, let me preface that for accuracy purposes. You know, the French Revolution was around 1789, and then the Napoleonic Wars were worldwide from around 1800 to 1815. So Great Britain and France were preoccupied, but we knew that we had lost life and limb and much blood and sacrifice, not only from the soldiers, but from the families. And many of us thought that the Articles of Confederation were going to be wholly inadequate to keep these 13 sovereign states thinking on the same terms, because the Declaration of Independence gave us just that, 13 sovereign states. And so there were some moves made in 1785 and 1786 to push the country forward. And one of them was a meeting at His Excellency General George Washington's home in Mount Vernon, which I was invited to but could not attend. And the next one was in 1786 in Annapolis, Maryland, at the convention there, at a convention there where His Excellency resigned his commission to become president of the later to become president of the United States. And there I met a very interesting gentleman, Mr. Alexander Hamilton. And he and I concurred that the Articles of Confederation were wholly inadequate. And we formed a partnership of like-minded men, being only 6 years apart. He was a bit like a brother. I never did form a close friendship with Mr. Hamilton, but it was certainly a close working relationship. And we decided that we had to do two very important things. One, convince Congress that we needed to reconvene in Philadelphia with all representatives from all of the 13 states, instead of just the 5 that attended the Annapolis Convention. Now, to be fair, there were others on the way and just didn't make it in time, but there were clearly 4 states that had no intention of coming at all. So the second thing that Mr. Hamilton and I specifically did was to try and convince His Excellency General George Washington to attend. Now, do you think he wanted to? He did not. He wanted to retire permanently and become his gentleman farmer back in Mount Vernon, and the war effort certainly did exhaust His Excellency. But because I said that there was no other way that we could convince delegates from all 13 states to arrive in Philadelphia again, that his personal presence was going to be powerful enough to make people understand that this was an important meeting, which really did come to be true. Mr. Hamilton talked to him, and I talked to him in person, so we almost had to drag him there. So then we got started with the convention, which I suppose you do have a question or two about that.
Well, certainly, sir. Thank you so much. That was a very detailed answer. I appreciate that. Now, when you did end up going to the Philadelphia Convention in 1787, there were some pretty impressive characters there. What was it like as one of the younger men at the time to be entering the arena and trying to convince some of these characters of the weight and necessity of reforming the government almost in its entirety?
Well, it was a heady objective for sure. I didn't get too caught up in who I was surrounded with. There were many men that arrived there and contributed to the proceedings, but there were many men that didn't really do much. They just came and left, and some of them never returned. But there was a dozen or so that were very much involved on a daily basis. And those men, of course, I revered. Dr. Franklin, top of the list, God rest his soul. We lost him in 1790. But he was sort of the leveling influence for all of the delegates because he didn't speak much. And unfortunately, I can't reveal too many details about the actual proceedings and the deliberations because we decided in the beginning, it was laid down sort of as law of the land by His Excellency that nothing be published or printed or communicated without leave. These proceedings were conducted in secrecy with an express purpose to allow these delegates to discuss ideas freely because we knew we were developing a governmental system that had never existed in world history.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much, sir. So fortunately, you were able to create this new government. And you mentioned earlier your working relationship with Alexander Hamilton. I understand you ended up working with him very closely again during the process of ratifying the Constitution. So would you like to explain exactly what the ratification process was and how you went about accomplishing it?
Well, certainly, I'd be glad to. For our constituents here, now that I'm president, we are celebrating, in my time, the 29th year of the Constitution. We're celebrating today, Mr. Mandresh. There's no guarantee, you see, sir, that this Constitution is going to continue without the informed consent of the people. And the ratification process was to convince those citizens and leaders that were against the Constitution, are called the Anti-Federalists. But you see, not everybody was against the Constitution. They just wanted conditions met. And so there were numerous conditions presented in order to say, all right, if you do this, this, and this, then we will ratify the Constitution. So it's not necessarily a very black and white situation, yes or no. It was a question of conditional ratification. And as there were conditions submitted, the most common one was a lack of individualized and enumerated Bill of Rights. So that was the biggest contentious issue, that if there was none, many of the state's leaders did not think that the Constitution was going to be fair enough. My good friend Thomas Jefferson in France was one of those people who said that very specifically that every just government deserved to give their people individualized rights. So the ratification process went along with that kind of thing in mind. And I was convinced that I needed to attend Virginia's ratifying convention personally, because there was a specific gentleman down there named Mr. Patrick Henry, who was opposed to the ratification of the Constitution. He never came to Philadelphia. He therefore didn't sign the Constitution, and then he was ardently opposed to its ratification. So along with some of the other Virginia delegates, we convinced the group in Richmond that ratification was proper. And we came on board very late at number 10, state number 10, after the ratification had been official. Congress reluctantly said that we need 9 of the states to approve the Constitution. And New Hampshire had done that on June the 21st of 1788, just under a year after we were deliberating these proceedings in the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia. But who was lacking was Virginia and New York. And arguably, those were the two most powerful states in the country. And even the other people were thinking, New York doesn't come on board and Virginia doesn't come on board, even though the Constitution has been ratified officially, will probably still fall apart. Because Mr. Madison came to the convention with all kinds of notes of things that he had studied, and his conclusion was that every single Republican system had eventually disintegrated. So that's why I want to make a final comment about how tenuous the situation still is about keeping this republic together. But back on point, sir. Then I rushed up upon the invitation of Mr. Alexander Hamilton to contribute to a series of anonymous essays submitted to New York newspapers. His governor, ironically, to become my second vice president, was George Clinton, and he was ardently against the Constitution. So when he was in Poughkeepsie, about maybe 70 miles or 80 miles up north, the Hudson's River, I stayed down in New York City and helped him write these anonymous essays. And Mr. Hamilton did a splendid job in convincing almost 40-6 that ratification was going to be a benefit to New York State, not a detriment. There were about 6 Federalists in that room and about 40 anti-Federalists, and he turned them around, which was an amazing feat. So a month after Virginia ratified, New York came along, and then 1789 was North Carolina, and the last straggler of all was Rhode Island. After our government was up and running in Philadelphia in 1790. Ironically, Rhode Island not only was the last to ratify, they never sent anyone to the convention in Philadelphia at all. They wanted to remain independent from the very first. But eventually they were convinced that little Rhode Island would just be usurped if they didn't. They couldn't really do anything on their own. They were so small. So that was the process of ratification that came along at much expense and much argument.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, sir. I know most Americans are grateful for your hard work, and I'm grateful you traveled to the future to talk to us today. Thank you, and please come back and talk to us another time, Mr. President.
I certainly would be happy to, Mr. Mandresh, anytime.
I hope you enjoyed that video as much as I did. Now, just to sum up, Mr. President James Madison was played by Kyle Jenks, who is an interpreter and has actually been on the show before. He was nice enough to come back a second time. So thank you, Mr. Jenks, aka the President Madison. And I will be looking forward to another interview for you guys coming very soon.